I'm Emily Carter, 32, head of a research annex my family never believed I'd run, and tonight I'm standing at my sister's award ceremony, uninvited but very present. I thought maybe, just maybe this time they'd see me as more than the girl who disappeared after the will reading. Even after inheriting the lab my grandfather built from scratch, I was still just the quiet one, the one they told to go earn her own. They handed Samantha a certificate and posed for photos while I stood near the back door, the one they never expected me to walk through. What they didn't know was I didn't come for a seat. I came to end the silence without saying a word. They set my plate last. No name card, no folded napkin, just a plain white plate placed at the far end of the table closest to the kitchen door furthest from the fireplace. It wasn't a mistake. It was design the kind that looks polite from a distance, the kind that says, "We didn't forget you," while also reminding you exactly where you stand. I arrived 7 minutes late, not intentionally. The train had stalled just outside Charleston for reasons no one explained, and the cab driver had circled the estate twice before finally spotting the gravel driveway hidden behind sycamores. I didn't text ahead. No one would have been waiting at the window. When I walked in, the house smelled like cinnamon and dry pine cones. The dining room table was already full, laughter forks clinking, the kind of warm chaos that photographs well. Barbara looked up first, her expression unchanged. "You made it," she said, like I was a surprise guest who'd wandered in off the street. Samantha turned with a glass of wine in hand, dressed in emerald silk that shimmered every time she moved. "We thought you'd changed your mind," she said, smiling without warmth. "Dinner started early this year." I nodded once, took off my coat, and placed it on the chair with no card. I sat down without needing to be told where. Dinner resumed like I hadn't interrupted anything. Barbara and Thomas sat at opposite ends of the long table, flanking Samantha like bookends. She was in the center, laughing at Thomas's story about some investor lunch, her hand brushing Barbara's wrist every now and then, in a way that looked affectionate to the untrained eye. To me, it looked strategic. The turkey was carved, the potatoes passed down. No one asked about my work or where I was living now. When I mentioned a recent grant we'd submitted for a regenerative crop project, Barbara simply said, "That's nice, dear," then turned to Samantha and asked how the consulting firm was expanding. I didn't push. I smiled and reached for the cranberries. At some point I looked up at the mantel. It had been redecorated sleek neutral tones, but the same line of family photos remained: Samantha shaking hands with a state senator, Samantha in her graduation cap, Samantha holding a glass award with some networking group's logo barely visible in the corner. One frame smaller than the rest had been turned around. I knew which photo used to be there. Grandpa and me in the greenhouse, 12 years old, covered in dirt, holding up a tray of seedlings like we'd discovered fire. He had that glint in his eye, the one that always showed up when he talked about what comes next. Samantha raised her glass suddenly. "To family," she said, "and to making the most of what we're given." Everyone clinked their glasses. I touched mine to the rim of my plate. No one noticed. The fireplace crackled. Thomas launched into a story about legacy, how families must steward what they've built. Barbara added something about strong hands guiding forward. Samantha leaned back, soaking in the spotlight with ease. I folded my napkin into a triangle. Grandpa used to do that every Thanksgiving. He said linen folded right could hold memory. I doubted anyone else remembered that. Midway through dinner, Barbara stood and tapped her glass with her fork. The room quieted. I felt the hush wrap around me like a shawl I didn't ask for. "I just want to take a moment." She began to honor Samantha. She's been nothing short of extraordinary this year, expanding her firm, mentoring young women, leading with poise and grace. Everyone applauded. Thomas even stood briefly. To Samantha, Barbara said, holding her glass high, "The future of this family." I took a sip of water. Across the table, Samantha bowed her head modestly. Her smile looked effortless. My plate was half full, the mashed potatoes cooling. I didn't speak. I didn't smile. I let the applause pass over me like static. When the clapping faded, the only thing I could hear was the clock on the mantel. It ticked louder than it used to. Or maybe I just had fewer distractions now. I glanced at Grandpa's chair. It had always been at the corner, slightly off-center, just like him. Tonight it was empty, but not tucked in, pulled out slightly, like someone had just stood up. And for a moment, maybe it was just the wind through the chimney. I could have sworn I heard him. Hold your place. As dessert was served, pecan pie with a dollop of whipped cream, Samantha's favorite Barbara reached across the table and placed a silver bracelet into her daughter's hand. "Your grandmother's," she said. "It's time it came to you." Samantha looked at it like it was made of light. "Mom," she whispered, "I thought this was lost." "I kept it for the right moment," Barbara replied, squeezing her hand. No one looked at me. I didn't expect anything, but it still felt like the kind of silence that presses behind your ears, the kind that makes soundless things ring. Thomas turned to Samantha, nodding approvingly. "You've earned it, kiddo." She slipped the bracelet on without hesitation. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, public. Across the table, my glass trembled slightly as I lifted it. I remembered asking about that bracelet when I was 16, back when Barbara found it in the old jewelry box in the attic. She told me it didn't suit me. Too delicate, she'd said. The silver caught the candlelight now flashing as Samantha raised her wrist to admire it. Conversation turned to investments, renovations, future plans. Thomas mentioned a new pool house proposal. Samantha asked about adding a fitness room. Barbara leaned into each suggestion like a campaign advisor. I felt like someone in the audience at a play I hadn't been cast in. When Thomas joked about the old maple tree out back finally falling, Samantha replied, "Maybe it's time to remove the roots." Barbara laughed, touched her shoulder. Spoken like someone who knows how to prune what no longer serves. I kept my hands folded in my lap. My nails had soil under them left over from the lab garden at the university annex. I'd meant to clean them before dinner, but the cab had arrived too soon. Barbara glanced at my hands once, then looked away without a word. The dinner plates were cleared. A staff member, someone they hired for events, brought in a tray of coffee. Cups were placed delicately around the table. Cream, sugar, brushed gold spoons. My cup had a chip on the rim. No one else's did. I watched Samantha stir her coffee with a kind of practiced elegance. She looked born into it. Maybe she was. Barbara announced that after coffee they'd move into the sitting room for a short family meeting. "Just a quick update on estate matters," she said almost offhandedly. Samantha nodded, already standing to adjust her dress. As everyone rose, I reached for my cup. The chipped rim caught my thumb, but I didn't flinch. I set it down untouched. We moved toward the sitting room. The hallway lights had been dimmed to create a sense of intimacy. The carpet muffled our steps. Samantha walked ahead of me, her heels clicking softly, the silver bracelet winking with each swing of her arm. I passed the photo wall again. A new frame had been added, Samantha shaking hands with the mayor. I paused a second longer than I meant to. When I entered the sitting room, there were already places set. Samantha's seat had a small velvet cushion on it. Barbara's was centered. Thomas poured himself a drink, and mine a dining chair pulled from the breakfast nook. No arms, no back support, slightly too low, off to the side. I sat anyway. Mr. Finch was already there, seated in a high-backed chair near the fire. His briefcase rested beside him, neat, understated. He wore charcoal gray, his tie a muted blue. Barbara greeted him warmly. "Harold, thank you for coming." He nodded politely. Walter wanted things done properly. The word Walter landed like a warm wind in the room. It made my chest thud once quietly. Everyone settled in. Samantha crossed her legs and smiled as if this were another ceremony. Barbara sat tall, hands folded, her posture a study in control. Thomas leaned back with an easy confidence, and me, I placed both feet flat on the floor. My palms rested open on my thighs. Still, quiet. Not absent, just not invited to speak. Finch adjusted his glasses and pulled a stack of papers from his briefcase. "Before we begin," he said, "I'd like to read Walter's final will and testament aloud as per his instruction." Barbara gave a tiny nod of approval. "Let's get through this." Samantha chuckled lightly. "Let's hear the legacy." I didn't smile. I kept my eyes on the edge of the coffee table where a single coaster sat slightly misaligned. Mr. Finch cleared his throat gently, the sound surprisingly firm in the hush. He began reading. His voice was even practiced, a man who had done this many times. I, Walter Carter, being of sound mind, do hereby declare this my last will and testament. The first few lines were legal language. Declarations, clauses, statements of clarity. Thomas tapped his glass with his ring in slow rhythm. Barbara glanced at Samantha. Everyone waited for the main event. To my son, Thomas Carter, I leave the lake property in Vermont, along with any tools or vehicles contained in the garage at the time of my passing. Thomas exhaled like it was obvious. To my daughter-in-law, Barbara Carter, I leave the family silver, the piano in the parlor, and all accompanying sheet music. Barbara blinked once. Her lips formed a flat line. Expected. Then came Samantha. To my granddaughter, Samantha Carter, I leave a cash gift in the amount of $10 million to be transferred from my primary account upon settlement. A pause followed. Samantha's shoulders squared. She didn't hide her smile. Thomas patted her back. Told you, he whispered. Barbara lifted her glass but didn't drink. Finch turned the page. To my granddaughter, Emily Carter. My heart didn't race. I didn't breathe differently. I'd long learned not to expect my name to be followed by anything other than silence. But Finch didn't pause. I leave my gratitude for her independence. May she always earn what she's meant to find. That was it. No properties, no accounts, just that. I stared at the rug. The pattern blurred slightly. May she always earn what she's meant to find. Samantha leaned in, clearly amused. That sounds spiritual. Barbara said nothing. I didn't move. Finch looked around the room, then gently gathered the papers into a neat stack. That concludes the official document. He slid it back into his case. The click of the latch echoed in the silence. Barbara stood first. Well, that settles it. Samantha followed Bracelet, catching the firelight. I think Grandpa knew who was going to do something with what he built. Thomas added, You've always worked hard, Sam. I stayed seated, not because I couldn't stand, but because I didn't want to rush through the moment, the part where they all assumed it was over. But Finch remained seated. His hand hovered over the briefcase, then moved to a separate folder tucked beneath the main stack. One more thing, he said calmly. Everyone paused. He pulled out a smaller envelope sealed with deep red wax. Samantha tilted her head. What's that? Finch turned it slowly in his hands. Walter left this letter to be read aloud, but only if every family member was present. Barbara's jaw tightened. Samantha's gaze flicked to me, then back to Finch. Well, she said flatly, we're all here, aren't we? Finch nodded once. He slid his thumb under the wax seal and cracked it clean down the center. The sound wasn't loud, but it landed like thunder. I didn't blink. I just sat still, not hoping, not expecting, but part of me listened. Because sometimes silence doesn't mean absence. Sometimes it means something's coming. The sitting room always felt colder after the lights dimmed, not in temperature but in spirit, as if the walls remembered things they weren't allowed to say. We hadn't moved yet. Finch still held the envelope unopened, the wax glinting faintly like a seal on an ancient map. Barbara glanced toward the hallway, then at her watch. Harold, it's getting late. I understand, he said, tone professional but not rushed. But Walter was clear. This letter was to be read only in the presence of the entire family, which we now have. Samantha huffed quietly and crossed her arms. Fine, read it. He opened the envelope slowly. The paper inside was thick, cream-colored, folded neatly in thirds. As Finch unfolded it, the room seemed to still. His voice when he began reading was quieter than before. To my family, he read what I built was never meant to be currency. It was meant to be continuity, and yet too often I've watched the name Carter passed like a trophy instead of carried like a responsibility. No one spoke. Some of you believed your proximity to me was enough. Others believed silence was the only thing I'd remember them for. Samantha shifted in her seat. Barbara's eyes narrowed. But the truth lives in what people do when no one is watching. Finch paused before continuing. To my granddaughter, Samantha, you were present. You visited, you smiled, you asked questions, but often they were the kind you already knew the answers to. I appreciated the gestures, but I always knew they were rehearsed. Samantha sat up straighter. "Excuse me." Thomas raised a hand toward her, gently signaling her to let it pass, but her expression cracked just slightly. "To my granddaughter," Emily Finch continued, "you were absent these past months, but not by choice. I know that now. What they told me, what they withheld from you, it changed the course of things. But I never stopped looking for signs of you, and you never stopped sending them." My throat tightened. Finch looked up, then back down. "The scientific journals you mailed, the articles you annotated, the grant proposals you never thought I'd read, I did." He cleared his throat. "And I want the family to hear this. My most valuable work, the research center, the lab, the seed vault, they were not created for admiration. They were created to be used, to be led. And I've made my decision." He set the letter down beside him. Samantha blinked. "What does that mean?" Barbara's voice followed, more clipped. "That wasn't in the original will." Finch reached into his case and pulled out a separate folder. This one was thinner, unmarked. He opened it carefully. Walter Carter filed a separate directive, a living trust which bypasses probate and supplements his last will. It pertains to intellectual property and all attached infrastructure, including the Laurel Creek Annex. Samantha stood up fast. "That's not possible." "It's legal," Finch said simply. "But he said he told me." She turned to Barbara, then Thomas. "You both said it was all going to me." Barbara didn't answer. Thomas leaned forward as if to say something, but stopped short. "He visited me less," Samantha went on, voice rising. "But I was there. I sent him updates. I brought him lunch. I said nothing." She turned her eyes on me then. "You weren't even around." I looked at Finch. He nodded slightly, then turned the page. Finch flipped to the last page in the folder, reading aloud without pause. "Walter Carter hereby transfers full ownership, operational rights, and stewardship of the Laurel Creek Annex, including all scientific equipment, data archives, proprietary seed development, and funding channels to Emily Carter." Samantha made a sound, a half laugh, half choke. "You're kidding." Barbara stood up slowly. "This is absurd. That facility is worth." Finch cut her off gently. Walter was thorough. He designated the transfer with legal witnesses, notarized it, and registered it independently. The state recognizes it as final. "I don't care what the state recognizes," Samantha snapped. "He gave her everything, the lab, the vault, the land." She turned to me. "You didn't even show up when he was sick." I stayed seated. My hands didn't move. I was told I said quietly that he didn't want visitors. Samantha scoffed. "By who?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Barbara folded her arms. "This isn't the time to dredge up old misunderstandings." Finch spoke again. "There's one more piece. Walter included a personal letter addressed to Emily. He requested it be read aloud." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Is that necessary?" Finch met his gaze. Walter believed in clarity. He unfolded a smaller sheet of paper and began to read. His voice softened as if even he wasn't ready for the weight of it. "To my Emily, if this is being read, then I'm no longer sitting in my chair at Laurel Creek. I hope the magnolias are still blooming." I blinked. My palms warmed. "You always asked questions no one else cared to ask. You looked at plants like they were puzzles. You tracked patterns in the soil before anyone showed you how. I saw that spark when you were 7 the afternoon you made a greenhouse from soda bottles and dental floss." I heard Samantha inhale sharply across the room. Finch continued. "You were the one they never saw. That doesn't mean you weren't there. I saw you." The letter went quiet for a moment in Finch's hands. Vanessa played the part they expected. She shined where the lights were. But you worked in the dark, trusting the roots to do their work. I looked down at my hands, soil still under my nails. "I didn't forget you. And I'm sorry they made you believe I had." Barbara suddenly stepped forward. "This letter is self-serving. It's emotionally manipulative." Finch didn't look at her. He kept reading. "Emily, this annex is yours, not because you asked for it, but because you never did." A silence settled in the room. Thick, slow, like honey poured over a wound. Samantha sat down heavily. Her bracelet clinked against the arm of the chair. "You think you're better than me now?" she said, not meeting my eyes. "No," I replied. And I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Barbara turned to Mr. Finch, her voice tight. "Are we supposed to pretend this is normal, that this transfer wasn't influenced?" Finch didn't flinch. Walter acted of sound mind. No one else was present during the drafting of the trust. He wanted this handled without interpretation. Thomas leaned forward. "You realize this divides the family." Finch looked over at him. It wasn't a division. It was a correction. The air shifted. Barbara sank back into her seat. She looked older in that moment. Not fragile, but peeled back, as if a layer had been scraped off and beneath it was something unpolished, unsettled. Samantha shook her head, laughing quietly to herself. "He knew I was next in line. He told me." She stopped. Her voice cracked on the last word. No one filled the silence. I looked at my mother. Her hands were folded so tightly the skin at her knuckles had gone white. She wouldn't look at me. And I didn't force her to, because this wasn't a victory. It wasn't a battle. It was just a truth that had waited too long to surface. Finch closed the folder gently. "This concludes the reading." Barbara stood abruptly. "Emily, if you had any decency," Barbara Finch interrupted, "I think we're done for tonight." She looked like she wanted to object, but didn't. Instead, she turned and walked out of the room, Thomas trailing behind her. They didn't slam the door. That would have required the kind of fire they no longer had. Samantha remained seated, staring at nothing. Her hand still rested on the bracelet. Finch reached down and placed the letter, the original, back into its envelope. He handed it to me without a word. I took it with both hands. "Walter wanted you to have that?" he said, then added softly, "Privately." I nodded. The room was nearly empty now. Finch gathered his papers and rose. "If you ever need help managing the legal transfer, I'll be available." "No pressure, I know," I said. As he left, I looked back at the table where coffee had long gone cold. My cup still sat untouched, the one with the chip on the rim. I walked over, picked it up, and poured its contents quietly into the sink just outside the sitting room. No one followed me. No one stopped me, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a guest in this house, just someone who had finally been seen. The next morning, the house was quiet, in the way that only old houses can be, where the silence isn't emptiness, but something left behind. I woke early, long before anyone else stirred. My childhood room hadn't changed much. The wallpaper had faded at the corners. The dresser still had the nick I'd made in 9th grade when I dropped a microscope lens while rushing to finish a science fair model. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting in my lap, letting the stillness settle. Grandpa's letter sat on the nightstand beside me, folded, untouched since the night before. I hadn't reread it. I didn't need to. The words felt etched into me. Downstairs, the floor creaked in the familiar pattern as I moved through the hall. The scent of coffee already brewing surprised me. I turned into the kitchen to find Grandma Margaret Carter standing at the counter pouring water into the kettle. She didn't look surprised to see me, so she said, without turning around, "You stayed." I nodded, unsure if she wanted an answer. She handed me a mug. "Drink." We stood for a moment in companionable silence. The kind I'd forgotten existed between two people who didn't feel the need to explain themselves. "I always told Walter he'd make a mess with those letters," she muttered, taking a slow sip from her cup. "But I suppose you can't stop a man determined to speak from the grave." I smiled softly. "He always knew how to make a point." She glanced at me, then reached for something tucked into the drawer by the stove. A small leather-bound notebook frayed at the edges, familiar. "He asked me to give this to you, said it was part of the story he couldn't fit in the letter." I took it carefully. The leather was soft from years of handling. When I opened it, the first page was covered in Grandpa's handwriting, dates, notes, observations, and my name at the top. He'd been tracking my work, all of it, even the parts I never told him about. "He never stopped believing in you," Grandma said, quieter now, "even when the rest of us didn't know what to believe." I swallowed against the ache in my chest. I thought I had more time, I admitted, to show him what I was building. "He saw it anyway," she replied. A quiet knock at the back door interrupted us. Not sharp, hesitant. Grandma glanced out the window. "He's early," who I asked. She opened the door. Mr. Finch stood there, coat-buttoned, briefcase in hand. "Good morning, Margaret. Emily." I nodded to him. He stepped inside without ceremony. "I won't stay long. There are some documents that need signatures. Formalities." He opened the briefcase on the kitchen table, spreading out papers with a calm, practiced rhythm. Everything in duplicate, highlighted fields, sticky tabs. "Once you sign these," he said, "the transfer of the annex is official. Full ownership. That includes the property line, the equipment, the staff contracts, and the IP portfolio." I stared at the line with my name on it. "Is it odd," I asked, "to inherit something you didn't even know was yours?" Finch looked at me, thoughtful. "It happens more than you think, but rarely with this much clarity." I signed, one stroke at a time, not because I was confident, but because the alternative was to remain silent in the wrong way. By mid-morning, the signatures were done, and Finch had left with a folder tucked under his arm. Grandma returned to her crossword puzzle at the sunroom table, as if nothing monumental had just happened. I stood alone in the foyer, the weight of a dozen legal acknowledgments hanging loosely across my shoulders. I looked down at the keys in my hand, 3 of them all worn. One brass, one steel, one with a faded blue cap like it had once lived on a lanyard. The car was still parked in the gravel lot behind the house. I slipped into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirror, and paused. My reflection looked more like a visitor than an heir, but I turned the key anyway. The drive to the annex wasn't long, maybe 20 minutes, but each mile felt like crossing into another version of myself, a girl who once spent summers charting pollen flow and chlorophyll density while the rest of the family vacationed in Bermuda. Laurel Creek hadn't changed much. The dirt road that wound through the trees was still uneven, still flanked by sycamores that leaned just a little too close to the windshield. But when the barn-turned laboratory came into view, something shifted in my chest. It wasn't grand. Not in the way Samantha's apartment or my parents' lake house had been. The building was long, low, and framed in reclaimed wood, but its bones were familiar, like a face you hadn't seen in years, but would know anywhere. I parked beside the oak tree where Grandpa used to chain up his old blue bicycle. The tree had grown bark, curling in deeper ridges now, but the notch from his pocket knife was still visible. I used the smallest key. The door creaked open slowly. Dust swirled in shafts of morning light slicing through the tall windows. The air smelled faintly of cedar iron and something sweet, beeswax maybe, or memory. Inside, the annex looked like it had waited for me. Tables lined with equipment. Microscope lenses still sheathed in protective caps. A centrifuge in the corner. On one shelf, a stack of blank lab notebooks, each stamped with the Whitman Research logo. The far wall held a whiteboard wiped clean, but faint equations still ghosted through the surface like they refused to be erased entirely. And then I saw it. At the center of the main workbench, my notebook. The one I thought I'd lost during my junior year, with diagrams of bee behavior experiments on root systems, a page titled, "Things I Wonder But Can't Yet Prove." The pages were worn corners, curled, the handwriting clumsy and urgent. I walked toward it slowly, almost afraid it would disappear, but it didn't. I picked it up, turned the pages, and there it was, Grandpa's handwriting in the margins. Just short notes. Try repeating this with filtered light. Ask Emily what happened on day 4. Her notes suggest a variable. He hadn't just kept it. He'd studied it. I sat down on the stool beside the bench and let the silence wrap around me. Not heavy, not hollow, just full like the quiet inside a greenhouse before the first leaf unfolds. That's when I realized something that went deeper than inheritance or legacy. He hadn't left this to me because I earned it. He left it because I was already using it even when I didn't know it was mine. I spent the rest of the day inside the annex, not working, not really, just existing in the space. I walked each hallway, ran my fingers across labeled drawers, peered into storage fridges that still hummed quietly. In the greenhouse, wing dust danced over dormant trays waiting for spring. And in the east corridor I found a small bulletin board pinned with sketches, airflow designs, sunlight angles, notes in Grandpa's unmistakable block letters. He had mapped this place for me long before he gave it to me. At some point I pulled out a fresh notebook from the shelf and scribbled a single word on the cover, begin. Later that evening, I returned to the Carter estate for one final night. Grandma had left a dinner tray on the counter, soup, a hunk of bread, and apples sliced neatly into quarters. There was a note beside it. You always ate better when you weren't trying to impress anyone. It made me smile. A small, honest one. Upstairs, I found my suitcase already zipped by the door. Barbara's doing, I assumed. A silent way of asking me not to stay too long. Old habits die elegant. I stepped into the guest room to wash my hands and caught my reflection in the mirror. My hair had come loose at the temples. My sweater was wrinkled. There were soil marks on my sleeves. But I looked steady, not glowing, not broken, just someone finally in the right room. I slept deeply that night, not because I was exhausted, but because nothing in me felt like it had to stay alert anymore. There was no audience to perform for, no spotlight to dodge, just silence, honest and clean. The next morning I left before sunrise. I didn't say goodbye to Barbara or Thomas. I didn't wait for Samantha to wake. I didn't knock on any doors. I just placed a small envelope on the kitchen counter, a thank you note addressed to Grandma, and stepped outside. The sky was still violet when I pulled onto the road. The house faded behind me in the rearview mirror, just a silhouette of sharp edges and long shadows. But I didn't look back. Not because I was angry, but because the only thing that mattered had already been said in soil and light and margins. At a red light near the edge of town, I rolled down the window. The morning air was cold, crisp, but gentle. Somewhere a dog barked. A truck engine coughed to life. I tapped the steering wheel twice, then turned left toward Laurel Creek, toward something waiting, toward something I didn't need to ask permission for anymore. The first week at the annex was quiet, not just in sound, but in rhythm. I arrived each morning before the sun touched the roof. The heat still hadn't been fully restored in the north wing, so I kept my coat on during the first few hours. The pipes moaned like they were waking from sleep. Dust gathered in corners I hadn't yet reached, and one of the greenhouse thermostats blinked erratically until I rewired it myself on day 3. But the silence, I welcomed it. There were no phone calls from Barbara, no texts from Samantha, no expectations to explain where I'd been or what I was doing. I moved from room to room with a slowness that felt deliberate, not stalled, like letting a house breathe again after years of being locked tight. I set up my workspace in the East Lab, the one with the highest windows and the view of the field where Grandpa once let me test compost designs. That field had gone wild since then, weeds mostly, but the soil underneath still rich. On the second Monday, I opened one of the file cabinets in the archive room and found a folder labeled in Grandpa's handwriting, Her Ideas. Inside were printed versions of every email I'd ever sent him, articles I'd forwarded, notes I'd scribbled and left behind after visits. One had a coffee ring stamped right over my signature. I read through them slowly, each page like a handshake from the past. That night, I sat on the floor of the greenhouse with the lights off. The stars outside were sharp. My breath left fog on the glass. I whispered, I'm here. No answer. No magic moment. Just the warm hum of heating coils in the floor and the faint rustle of plastic trays settling into their shelves. And that was enough. Midweek, I drove into town and visited the local university. I hadn't planned to. But I walked past the campus library and noticed a flyer taped to the door, Spring Internship Applications Now Open, Local Agriculture Partnerships Encouraged. I stood there a full minute before walking in. The science coordinator was a woman named Dr. Lillian Cross, mid-50s, sharp eyes, short sentences. She listened as I explained the Laurel Creek Annex, its mission, and what I hoped to build from it, not just research, but outreach. Education, local impact. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she tapped her pen twice on the desk and said, "Show me the space." That Friday she came, wore hiking boots and a navy scarf, asked pointed questions, took photos of the seed vault and greenhouse, looked over the workbench where my childhood notebook still sat open, its pages flattened by time. When we stood beneath the annex's south arch where Grandpa's original blueprint still hung framed on the wall, she turned to me and said, "It has soul." I exhaled. "I'm trying not to waste it." "You won't," she said, "but let me help make sure." By the end of the visit, we'd sketched the outline for a pilot program local students one semester access to lab space and field plots, real experiments, real tools, and a place to ask questions out loud, just like Grandpa let me. In the weeks that followed, the annex began to shift not in structure, but in energy. We swept out the unused wings. I installed fresh bulbs in the west corridor. The dust was replaced by movement, the shuffle of chairs, the clicking of keyboards, the hum of lab machines warming up after too long in silence. Dr. Cross returned with 2 graduate students, Tara, who specialized in soil ecology, and Micah, a quiet researcher who carried a notebook everywhere, but rarely spoke unless asked. I liked that about him. He reminded me of the version of myself that used to observe before speaking, or maybe still did. We met twice a week, first in the main lab, then eventually in the annex library, which Grandpa had converted from an old hayloft. We brought in whiteboards, spread out samples, argued about micro-irrigation formulas. It felt messy, imperfect, and alive. One afternoon, while sorting through a supply cabinet, I found a cardboard box labeled "For Her." Inside were items I hadn't seen in years. My old lab coat from high school, a glass beaker I once etched with a honeybee for fun, and a small metal key with no tag. I turned the key over in my hand. The teeth were worn smooth. I didn't know what it unlocked. I didn't throw it away. Instead, I slipped it onto a chain and wore it under my sweater. Not because I believed in signs, but because sometimes a key means more before you know where it fits. Around that time, word started to spread. Quietly at first, a professor here, a local farmer there. People began reaching out, some curious, some skeptical. But one message stopped me cold. It came in the form of a letter handwritten, "No return address." Inside was a single line. He never showed me that side of himself. It wasn't signed, but I knew the handwriting. Samantha. I didn't know what to do with it. There was no demand, no apology, no anger. Just a line, raw, unresolved. A sentence that sounded more like a door left ajar than anything final. I folded it once and slid it between the pages of my childhood notebook, not to hide it, just to let it breathe in a space where nothing had to be sorted out yet. Later that week, while Micah was running tests and Tara was reviewing grant templates, I stepped outside into the field behind the annex, the same place where Grandpa once let me plant my first clumsy row of drought-tolerant beans. The rows had failed, but I remembered the look on his face when I explained why. He didn't smile or correct me. He'd simply said, "Try again. You're close." Now I stood in the same dirt and whispered, "I'm trying again." Wind moved through the tall grass, rustling like paper. I took it as a yes. By the start of spring, we had 10 students enrolled in the pilot program. Some were local high schoolers with dirt under their nails and questions too big for their classrooms. Others came from the nearby community college, skeptical but curious. All of them were given lab coats, one size too big, and journals with "Ask, Test, Repeat" stamped across the front. The greenhouse bloomed with their first projects: controlled soil studies, compost layering experiments, an ambitious attempt at hydroponic tomatoes that failed gloriously in week 2. We celebrated that failure with lemonade and a chalkboard full of crossed-out ideas. One afternoon, as we discussed plant resilience and weather unpredictability, a girl named Clara raised her hand. "What if a plant adapts to a lie?" she asked. The room went still. She wasn't asking about plants. I met her eyes and nodded once. Then it finds a new way to grow. Later, I gave her a fresh notebook and said nothing else. That same week, I received an email from Finch. Short and formal as always, subject visitor request message. Samantha Carter would like to visit the annex. Timing flexible, no legal discussion requested, personal only. I read it twice, then again. I didn't reply for 2 days. On the 3rd morning, I typed one sentence: "She can come Friday. Morning is best." When the day arrived, I woke earlier than usual. The sky was gray low with clouds the kind that promise rain but don't follow through. I opened the annex before sunrise, made coffee, laid out a single extra lab coat on the rack by the door. She arrived just past 9. I heard her heels on the gravel before I saw her, but when she stepped inside, I barely recognized her. No jewelry, no blowout, just a navy coat too big for her frame, her hair tied back, no makeup. She stood just inside the doorway, not crossing the threshold. "I didn't come to fight," she said. "I didn't ask you to," I replied. She looked around at the walls, the rows of glassware, the students' display boards pinned in the hall. "I didn't know this place existed," she said. "Not really." "It did," I answered. "You just never looked for it." She nodded once, not in agreement, just acknowledgement. We walked in silence through the annex. I showed her the greenhouse, the fermentation tanks, the old irrigation pumps Grandpa kept running longer than he should have. She didn't ask many questions, but the ones she did were careful. "What's this used for? Do the students get to publish their work? Did you ever get that bee communication model to work?" By the time we reached the community garden, she had stopped pretending this was just a tour. Children were harvesting lettuce with compost-stained gloves. A father was kneeling beside his son, pointing to a moisture gauge. In the distance, Tara explained seed rotation to a grandmother in Spanish. Samantha leaned on the railing, fingers curled around the wood. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, eyes still forward. I didn't answer. "I just wanted to see what he built for you," she continued, "and what you built with it." She didn't cry, but her hands wouldn't stop moving. I let her stand there as long as she needed. No speech, no lecture, just space. And in that silence, something settled. Not resolved, not erased, but planted. The invitation came on the last Monday of April. A formal envelope with my name printed cleanly on the front, no return address, just the family crest in gold ink. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from. Inside cream cardstock, thick and deliberate. "You are cordially invited to a celebration of Samantha Carter's appointment to the State Environmental Advisory Board, hosted by Thomas and Barbara Carter. Friday, 6 p.m., the Carter residence." I read it once, then again. And then I set it down on my desk next to the microscope, where it sat like a misplaced fossil. It wasn't surprising. Samantha had been rebuilding herself, volunteering at the annex, helping with outreach, even writing a short communication guide for our students. She was learning to be useful without fanfare. But this public event, a room full of legacy guests, a toast, and they wanted me there, or rather, they needed me there, because leaving me out this time would say more than they were ready to admit. I didn't RSVP. I just showed up. Friday came cold and sharp. Rain threatened all day but never fell. I wore navy, the same shade Grandpa used to favor. The pocket of my coat held his old fountain pen, still dried out, still warm from memory. When I arrived, the house was already humming. Cars lined the drive. The porch lights glowed like they always had, but everything felt staged, like a replica of the house I grew up in, too polished around the edges. Barbara opened the door. She didn't flinch. "Emily," she said. "You look," she paused, "well." "Thank you," I replied. We didn't hug. Inside the entryway had been redecorated. Neutral tones, curated photos. A new portrait of Samantha hung above the mantel, crisp official backlit like a campaign ad. People I didn't know sipped wine and complimented the floral arrangements. There was soft jazz playing somewhere, and trays of hors d'oeuvres I couldn't name. Samantha stood near the center of the room in a fitted charcoal suit, speaking with a man who looked vaguely familiar, probably from the mayor's office. Her back was straight, her smile rehearsed. When she saw me, her smile shifted. Just slightly. She excused herself and walked over. "You came?" she said. "You invited me?" I replied. "I didn't think you would. Neither did I." She nodded once. "There's a moment later, when they hand me the certificate. I'd like you to be there." "I will be," I said. "No more. No less." Behind us, Barbara was making rounds, introducing guests, explaining the family's deep ties to agricultural development. Thomas laughed too loud at something a guest said near the fireplace. I drifted to the side of the room and watched. Not hiding, just seeing. That was when I noticed Mr. Finch standing alone by the bookshelf, sipping something clear. He gave me a polite nod. "Thought they'd never pull you back into this house," he said as I approached. "Neither did I replied. His gaze swept the room. It's not about Samantha, you know. Not really. It's about proving nothing's changed. And has it? He smiled faintly. Let's find out. The living room buzzed with polite admiration. One guest called Samantha a symbol of modern environmental leadership, while another asked Barbara if the family had always been so civically engaged. I stood by the sideboard, unnoticed, watching as the narrative unfolded without interruption. It reminded me of childhood dinner parties, the ones where I poured lemonade while Samantha performed. The script hadn't changed. Only the stakes had. When the music softened, Thomas tapped a spoon against his glass. The room hushed with practiced attention. "Thank you all for coming," he said, standing beside the fireplace, arm around Barbara. "Tonight we celebrate Samantha Carter, our daughter, our pride, and her appointment to the State Environmental Advisory Board." Polite applause, a few whoops from the younger guests. Samantha smiled just the right amount. Thomas continued. Samantha's dedication to sustainable growth and environmental integrity reflects the legacy this family has always held close. Always Barbara stepped in, voice smooth. It's in her blood, just like it was in Walter's. There it was. The invocation. The link to Grandpa. I felt my fingers curl slightly around the base of my glass. And now, Thomas said, lifting a certificate framed in brushed gold, we present this token of recognition not just from the board, but from the Carter family. Samantha stepped forward. The room leaned in. She accepted the frame, holding it with both hands. Then she turned to the crowd and began her speech, short, polished, full of terms like legacy and vision and the future of environmental resilience. She mentioned the annex once briefly as a place of community outreach, but not by name. And then she looked at me, just for a second. Then she said, but none of this would mean anything without the foundation we stand on. And sometimes we only recognize the value of what we ignored once it's been built without us. There was a shift in the room, tiny, but real. Someone near the window glanced in my direction. Another turned slightly in their seat. Mr. Finch crossed his arms. I didn't move. "I want to acknowledge," Samantha continued, "my sister Emily, who's shown me and all of us what quiet leadership looks like. The annex is not just a research facility, it's a living blueprint of integrity." More silence. Then applause. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real. Barbara's smile tightened. Thomas clapped once, then adjusted his tie. I set down my glass. Samantha met my gaze again, and this time she held it. Just long enough. When the speeches ended, people began milling again. The room broke into smaller conversations, but I could feel the shift subtle as it was, eyes lingering a bit longer, questions pivoting toward me. I made my way to the hallway. Behind me, someone whispered, "That's the one who runs the annex, right? Another, did you see the article last month?" The youth science program. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I stepped out onto the back patio for air. The garden was lit with low string lights swaying slightly in the wind. It had always been Barbara's domain, symmetrical hedges, flower beds that bloomed more for show than scent. But now, in the quiet, it felt almost beautiful, controlled, predictable. Samantha joined me a moment later, still holding the certificate. "I meant what I said," she offered. "I know," I said. She exhaled, her breath fogging slightly in the cool air. "They didn't want me to mention you. Said it would complicate the narrative." "It usually does," I said. She looked down at the frame in her hands. "They still think this makes them right, that all of this proves their version of the story was always true." I said nothing. But tonight, when I said your name, I felt it shift, just a little. I felt it too. She turned to me. "You're not coming back inside, are you?" I shook my head. "I've already been seen." That made her laugh, a short, real sound. "Do you remember the time I locked you out of Dad's office before the science fair? I remember. You didn't say anything. You just built the whole trifold display again from scratch. It won second place. You should have won." "I did," I said softly. "Just not in a way they could measure." We stood in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't rush to be filled. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "Not for the past. I'm not there yet. but for pretending the annex was ever mine to explain. I nodded once. Thank you. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is for you. It's a student essay from the program. I helped her edit it. She mentioned you said your question made her want to study soil biology. I took the paper, holding it carefully. I'll read it later. I should go back in, Samantha said, stepping away. I stayed where I was, listening to the door click shut behind her. The garden lights buzzed faintly. A wind chime stirred near the porch. I looked up at the sky, the stars faint, but still there, steady above the cloud cover. Inside, they would toast again. Photos would be taken. The portrait of Samantha would stay above the mantel. But they would remember tonight, not because of a speech, but because silence had finally spoken, not in anger, not in defense, just by standing still and letting the truth arrive on its own feet. I turned toward the side gate and let myself out. My car was parked where I'd left it, away from the others beneath the old elm tree. As I reached for the door, my phone buzzed once. A text from Dr. Cross. That funding came through. They want a second annex in North Carolina. I stared at the screen, then tucked the phone into my coat. The wind moved through the branches above. Leaves rustled like applause. I didn't smile, but I didn't need to. 6 years have passed since the will reading. 6 years since that velvet chair in the sitting room, since the chipped teacup, since Mr. Finch's voice broke the hush with Grandpa's letter and broke something open in me that had never quite healed. I haven't been back to the Carter estate since that night. Sometimes I hear about it in passing, a feature in a local magazine about Thomas's new vineyard plans, or a charity gala Barbara co-hosted for historical preservation. They moved to Florida 2 years ago. Early retirement, I think. I didn't send a card. Samantha still lives nearby. We don't talk often, but we don't avoid each other either. Twice a year she volunteers with the youth science camp. She helps the kids prepare for presentations, how to explain their data without shrinking into the floor, how to stand beside their posters with a kind of quiet certainty. They call her Coach V. It started as a joke, but it stuck. She never refers to herself as a scientist. But sometimes when no one's watching, I catch her taking notes in the margins of their reports, circling words, writing suggestions in soft pencil. It's a language she's still learning, and I think she wants to. The annex has grown beyond anything I imagined. What started as one barn and a promise is now a full research campus. We have 4 labs, 3 greenhouses, 60 acres of trial fields that shift with the seasons like a patchwork of potential. We've developed drought-resistant seed strains that are now in rotation across 5 southern states, partnered with a university in Brazil, launched a joint fellowship with Kenya's leading regenerative farming institute. The mission hasn't changed, but the reach has. Last month, I stood on a stage in San Francisco, accepting a national grant for climate innovation. The ballroom was packed. Spotlights tracked my steps. I wore navy, the color Grandpa always said made me look like I was thinking about something important. In my breast pocket was his old pocket watch, still working, still heavy. Inside the lid, a faded photo of me at age 10, grinning beside a cardboard display covered in honeybee diagrams. My handwriting crooked but proud. Grandma gave it to me the year before during one of our morning coffees. She lives in a small apartment now attached to my house in town. Slower these days, more forgetful, but still sharp in moments that matter. She told me Grandpa carried that photo every day. Now it sits on my desk, angled toward the morning light. When the sun hits it just right, it casts small, perfect circles over my research notes like gentle reminders, or quiet applause. Some days I sit at the edge of the east greenhouse and watch the students walk between the field plots, arms full of notebooks, laughter echoing off the metal siding. They argue over hypotheses, celebrate small breakthroughs, mourn wilted leaves like they lost a friend. It's messy. It's honest. It's everything I ever wanted this place to be. A few months ago, one of the high schoolers, a wiry boy named Devin, approached me after class. He held out a soil sample bag and said, "This came from my grandmother's garden." She passed, but I thought, maybe we could test if it still remembers her. I blinked, took the bag, and wrote a grant proposal the same night. We got the funding. Now Devin's running an entire study on legacy soil memory. It's far from perfect, his data logging is chaotic, and his control group is questionable, but his questions are real. And that's the part I care about. Last week I found an old box buried beneath the West Wing shelving. It was labeled in Grandpa's hand, "Untested Ideas." Inside were napkins covered in scrawled formulas, faded receipts with notes in the margins, even a blueprint for a hybrid greenhouse coop system we'd once joked about but never built. I laughed so hard I startled one of the interns. Then I sat on the floor and cried. Not because I missed him more than usual, but because somehow, even in absence, he was still leaving me questions to answer. That night I brought the box home. Grandma sat beside me as I spread the contents across the sunroom table. Her fingers traced the lines like they were prayers. "He never threw anything away," she whispered, said every scrap had a heartbeat. We stayed there until the light faded, talking in half-sentences, remembering, being. In a world that moves so fast, sometimes I think memory is the only thing that gives weight to motion. That and roots. When I walk the fields at dusk, I still pause at the wooden bench Grandpa built with his own hands. The wood has softened with time, the screws a little loose, but it holds. It always holds. From that bench, I can see the constellations begin to flicker above the tree line. Orion first, then Cassiopeia. The real stars, not the glow-in-the-dark ones we stuck to my ceiling when I was 9. Though sometimes I still picture those too. And I think of the girl I used to be. The one who asked questions before anyone taught her what answers were supposed to sound like. The one who once mistook silence for failure. She's still here. She's just learned when not to fill the quiet. This morning, I brewed coffee early. The kitchen window steamed slightly from the kettle, and outside the field shimmered with dew. I could hear Grandma stirring in her room, her slippered footsteps soft against the wood floors. I placed her cup on the tray, 1 sugar no cream, and walked it over to the sunroom. She was already waiting in her chair blanket over her knees, eyes scanning the trees. "You're up early," she said, voice raspier now, but still steady. "So are the wild radishes," I said, setting the tray down. "They've overrun bed 4. She chuckled. "Good. Nature should win sometimes." We sipped in silence the way we always do. Then she told me something I hadn't heard before. That first year after Walter died? I didn't know what to do with myself. The house got too big. The days got too quiet. I kept looking at the clock like he'd walk in again. I waited. I almost sold the ranch. I turned toward her, surprised. I had a realtor on the phone. Told them to come take pictures. But that night I opened his desk drawer and found your old journal, the one with the bee diagrams. He'd marked pages, left sticky notes. Ask her about this. What did she see here? She looked at me then. And I thought, no, not yet. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "Thank you," I said. We finished our coffee, watching squirrels chase each other across the fence. Later, I walked to the annex. The building glowed in the early light, not from electricity, but from use, from the movement, the rhythm of something living. I walked the perimeter like I always do, checking the gate locks, noting where the vines crept too far. At the main entrance, someone had chalked a quote on the sidewalk, "Write the things they don't understand. One day the world will." I stopped, stared, then smiled. It was a line from Grandpa's letter, one I'd read 100 times, one I hadn't realized I'd said out loud in front of the students. I didn't erase it. I didn't correct the handwriting or straighten the edges. I just stood there, still, quiet, full. Because this was the ending no one clapped for. And yet it echoed, not with thunder, but with roots growing in the dark, with doors left unlocked, with a name spoken softly not to claim space, but to honor the one already earned. I turned back toward the field. Somewhere behind me, a wind moved through the trees. It carried no message, but I heard it anyway. And this time I didn't just listen. I answered. Some stories don't end with applause or apology. They end with a gate left open, a light still on, and a woman walking forward not to be seen, but because she finally sees herself.